It was late evening when the quiet hum of the engine echoed down a lonely stretch of road. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind a soft orange glow that faded into blue. A senior Army lieutenant colonel was driving home after spending the weekend visiting his parents. He had been away for most of his career, moving from base to base, serving his country with steady loyalty. That night he wasn't thinking about medals or ranks. He was thinking about a warm shower, a proper meal, and the comfort of his own bed. The road was calm, surrounded by tall pine trees on both sides. There were no other cars in sight, just the steady rhythm of the tires rolling on the asphalt. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was almost 9. He expected to reach home in less than an hour. His phone sat on the passenger seat, buzzing occasionally with messages from his unit about an upcoming ceremony. He smiled quietly, thinking how proud his parents had looked that morning when they spoke about his service. His life had been about discipline. Every task, every move, every word, he believed in doing things the right way. People around him respected that. Younger soldiers admired him for being strict but fair. He believed in calmness even in chaos. That calmness had saved lives on the field, and it had earned him the reputation of a true leader. As he drove through the quiet highway, he noticed flashing red and blue lights appear in his rearview mirror. For a second he thought maybe an ambulance was coming, so he slowed down and moved slightly to the side. But the lights didn't pass. They stayed behind him. The siren gave a short burst. He frowned softly, confused. He was sure he hadn't been speeding. He glanced at his dashboard. He was exactly at the limit. The tail light indicator was normal. Everything seemed fine. Still, he did what every law-abiding person would do. He signaled, slowed down, and pulled over carefully to the shoulder of the road. He put the car in park, turned off the radio, and waited. He rolled the window halfway down, placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, and took a quiet breath. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped, but there was something about the darkness of that road that made him uneasy. 2 police cars had pulled up behind him. One of the vehicles left its spotlight on, shining directly into his side mirror. It was bright enough to blur his reflection. He squinted slightly, trying to make out the figures stepping out from behind the blinding light. 2 officers approached, one on each side. Their steps were sharp, firm. He could hear the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. The first officer stopped just behind his window and said something he couldn't quite hear. The colonel turned off the engine and waited for a clearer instruction. "License and registration," the officer finally said, his tone curt and cold. "Yes, sir," the colonel replied calmly. "My wallet is in my right pocket and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'll move slowly." "Go ahead," the officer said, though the tension in his voice was noticeable. The colonel reached slowly, exactly as he said he would, and handed over his documents. The officer barely glanced at them before looking toward the second officer, who was standing near the rear of the car, shining a flashlight into the back seat. "What's the problem, officer?" the colonel asked, keeping his tone polite. "Your taillight's broken," came the reply. He blinked in surprise. "That can't be right. I checked the lights before leaving my parents' place." The officer didn't respond. He walked back toward his car, documents in hand. The second officer stayed behind, his flashlight still sweeping across the car interior as if expecting to find something hidden. Minutes passed slowly. The colonel could hear the faint sound of radio chatter from the police car behind him. He remained still, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The longer he sat there, the more he felt something was off. Usually traffic stops were quick, 5 minutes, maybe 10. But this one was stretching longer than usual. When the first officer returned, his expression had changed. There was a look of suspicion that didn't make sense. "Step out of the vehicle," he said flatly. The colonel was taken aback. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" "Step out," the man repeated more firmly. He hesitated for a moment, his military instinct telling him to remain calm. He had been trained for far worse situations. With a slow exhale, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The air outside was cool and carried the faint scent of rain. He stepped out carefully, keeping his hands visible. The second officer moved closer, standing just a few feet away. "Keep your hands where we can see them," he said sharply. "They're right here," the colonel replied, lifting them slightly in plain sight. "May I ask what this is about?" The first officer circled the car, glancing at the license plate, then back at him. "You fit a description," he said. "A description?" "Yeah, of someone involved in a robbery earlier tonight." The colonel's heart sank, not out of fear, but disbelief. "Officer," he said softly, "I'm an active duty Army officer. I'm driving home from my parents' house. You can check my ID. I've never been involved in anything like that." The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he seemed to be studying him, looking for some excuse to justify the stop. The colonel could feel the situation shifting. Something wasn't right. He knew from experience that sometimes calm didn't always disarm aggression, but losing calm never helped either. "I'd like to cooperate fully," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Please contact my base. They can confirm my identity." But his words seemed to bounce off the wall of tension around him. The second officer muttered something to the first, something he couldn't catch, and they both stepped back toward their cars. The colonel stood by the roadside, the flashing lights still spinning red and blue around him, the quiet of the woods mixed with the hum of the police radios. His heart beat slower than most people's would in that moment. Years of service had taught him control, but deep down he couldn't shake the question, why was this happening? Minutes dragged on. Cars passed occasionally in the distance, but no one stopped. He could see the faint reflection of himself in the side mirror, still standing straight, still calm. When the officers returned again, their demeanor hadn't softened. The one holding his ID handed it back without a word, but his face carried an expression that was hard to read. "Am I free to go, officer?" the colonel asked politely. There was a pause. The question seemed to unsettle them for a second. Finally, the first officer nodded slightly. "Yeah, just get that tail light fixed." The colonel gave a short nod, still unsure if he should feel relieved or disturbed. "Yes, sir. I'll have it checked first thing in the morning." He got back into his car, closed the door, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel again, and he stared through the windshield where the road stretched endlessly into the dark. He took a slow breath. Something about the entire encounter didn't feel routine. The way they looked at him, the way they talked, it wasn't professional. It was personal. And though nothing worse had happened that night, a chill had settled deep in his chest. As he drove away, he checked the side mirror one last time. The police cars remained parked, their lights still flashing faintly in the distance. He could see one of the officers talking into his radio, watching as the colonel's car disappeared down the road. He tried to shake the feeling. He turned on the radio again, letting the soft hum of a late-night talk show fill the silence. The host was discussing military heroes, people who had served quietly without expecting glory. He smiled faintly at the irony. The night was calm again, but his thoughts weren't. He couldn't stop wondering why the officers had acted that way. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, he told himself. Maybe they were on edge because of the robbery they mentioned. But deep down, something told him it wasn't that simple. By the time he reached home, the clock had passed 10. He parked the car, got out, and looked at the taillights. Both were glowing perfectly red. Not a single crack or flicker. He stood there for a long moment staring at the lights before finally walking toward his front door. Inside, the house was quiet. He hung his jacket, placed his keys on the table, and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. The silence of home should have felt peaceful, but that night it didn't. It felt heavy. He thought about calling someone, maybe a fellow officer or his base commander, to report what had happened. But it was late and he didn't want to make a fuss. He decided to let it go for now. Still, as he sat there in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through his window, he couldn't ignore the thought that maybe this wasn't over. Maybe that strange stop was just the beginning of something larger, something that would soon draw attention far beyond that quiet stretch of road. The next morning began quietly. The sun filtered through the curtains, lighting up the small living room where the lieutenant colonel had fallen asleep on the couch. His uniform jacket still hung on the wall, and the faint sound of birds came from outside. For a moment everything seemed peaceful again, but the unease from the night before hadn't faded. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The memory of the flashing red and blue lights came back like an unwanted echo. He walked to the window, looking out at his car parked in the driveway. The taillights were still perfect. There was no damage, no sign of anything wrong. He stood there for a few seconds, then sighed. He knew something about that stop had been off. Years of leadership had taught him to trust his instincts. He'd faced complicated situations overseas. Moments when he could feel tension in the air before anyone spoke. What he felt last night was the same kind of tension, one that had no reason to exist. He decided to document what had happened, just in case. Sitting at his kitchen table, he took out a small notebook and began writing down the details. Time, location, how the officers behaved, what they said, what they accused him of. He even noted their car numbers and the short, sharp tone in their voices. He didn't do it out of anger, just caution. Military training had taught him that records matter. After breakfast, he got dressed and drove to the nearest mechanic's shop to check his car lights. The mechanic tested everything and looked confused. "Nothing wrong here, sir," he said politely. "All lights are working fine." The colonel smiled faintly. "That's what I thought. Thank you." Driving away, he couldn't help but replay the moment when the officer said he fit a description. It didn't make sense. He wasn't near any robbery and his route was quiet. Maybe it was a mistake, he told himself again. But if it was, why had the officers looked so tense? Why had they been so rude? He pushed the thoughts aside for the rest of the day, throwing himself into his usual work routine. He spent hours on calls with his team, reviewing logistics for upcoming training operations. Yet even in the middle of discussions, his mind would drift back to that dark road. That evening, his phone rang. It was an old friend from the base, who'd heard about the strange traffic stop from someone at the local precinct. "I don't know all the details," the friend said cautiously, "but word's going around that those same officers pulled over 2 other drivers last week. Both reported similar treatment." The colonel paused, listening carefully. "Did anyone report it officially?" "Not yet. People usually let it go, but it's not sitting right with folks around here." After hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall for a long while. He wasn't the kind of man to seek trouble. But something about this felt bigger than him. It wasn't just about one bad experience, it was about a pattern. Later that week, he received an invitation to a small community event honoring veterans. It was scheduled for the weekend, and though he hadn't planned to attend, he decided to go. Maybe it would help him clear his mind. The gathering took place at a town hall not far from where he had been stopped. The place was filled with people, families, local officials, and veterans from all branches. He greeted people warmly, smiling as children waved little flags. For a few hours the mood was light, but as he stepped outside after the ceremony, he noticed a familiar car parked across the street, a black and white police cruiser. The same type from that night. His chest tightened slightly. He wasn't sure if it was the same officers, but something about the way the car was parked, half hidden behind a tree, felt intentional. He told himself not to overthink it and started walking toward his own car, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He drove home carefully, keeping his distance from any patrol vehicles he saw. When he reached home, he decided to contact someone higher up, not to file a complaint yet, but to make a record of the stop within military channels. He sent a formal note through the internal system, explaining briefly what happened. It wasn't emotional, just factual. 2 days later, he received a call from a liaison officer from the Pentagon. The voice on the line was professional and firm. "Colonel, thank you for reporting this. We're taking note of your statement. If this incident escalates, you'll be contacted for a formal review." That reassurance helped, at least for the moment. Still, life didn't return to normal. Each time he drove past a patrol car, he noticed his heart rate pick up slightly, something that never used to happen. He had been through war zones, led soldiers under pressure, yet a roadside encounter at home now made him uneasy. One evening, while he was sitting at home reviewing some reports, there was a knock on his door. It was a neighbor, an older man who often walked his dog past the colonel's house. "Hey, just thought you should know," the neighbor said quietly. "Those 2 officers have been driving up and down this street the last couple of nights. Kinda slow, like they're looking for something." The colonel frowned slightly. "You're sure?" "Yeah, I saw them twice. Same car numbers you mentioned before. Thought maybe they were just patrolling, but it seemed odd." "Thank you," the colonel said, shaking his hand firmly. "I appreciate you telling me." After the neighbor left, he stood by his window looking out into the night. The street was empty now, but the knowledge that they had been circling his neighborhood made his stomach tighten. He thought about calling the local police department to ask why, but something told him that might make things worse. Instead, he decided to stay alert, to keep notes and to remain calm. He wasn't going to act out of fear. The following morning, he went about his regular duties. He had to attend a meeting at a nearby base. As he drove through the same stretch of highway where the incident occurred, he noticed faint marks on the roadside, like the place where he had pulled over before. It looked so normal in daylight, so ordinary, that it was hard to believe anything had felt wrong there at all. But deep inside, he knew it had. That afternoon, after his meetings ended, he stopped at a cafe near the base to grab some coffee. A few other officers were sitting at a corner table, talking quietly. One of them glanced up and said, "Colonel, I heard about that incident with the local police. You okay?" He nodded. "I'm fine. Just a strange encounter. Be careful out there," one of them said. "There's been tension between the local department and federal officers lately. Some people don't take kindly to being corrected." He gave a small nod, appreciating the concern. "I'll be fine. I've handled worse." Still, their words echoed in his mind. That night back home, he sat outside on his porch, sipping a cup of tea while watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue. The hum of crickets filled the air. It should have been peaceful, yet his mind wouldn't settle. He thought about how, as a soldier, he had been trained to defend his country, to serve honorably, without expecting special treatment. Yet the irony wasn't lost on him that danger could find him not on a battlefield overseas, but on a quiet American road, under flashing lights. He picked up his phone and looked through his messages. A new one had arrived, from a Pentagon contact confirming receipt of his previous note. It ended with a single line. "If there are any further incidents, do not engage. Contact us immediately." He stared at those words for a long time. They meant the higher-ups were watching, paying attention. That gave him a sense of security, a small one, but enough to ease the unease for the night. Before going to bed, he made sure his outdoor camera system was working. It wasn't paranoia. It was just precaution. Years in the service had taught him that preparation was never wasted. As he turned off the lights and lay down, he could hear the soft hum of distant cars passing outside. The road was never completely quiet. He closed his eyes, but his mind kept replaying the moment the flashlight had shined through his window, the tone of the officer's voice, the coldness in it. He didn't know it yet, but that unease would soon grow into something much larger, something that would draw national attention and shake more than just his small town. For now, though he tried to rest unaware that the story had only begun to unfold, and that soon, everyone from his hometown to the Pentagon would know his name. A week passed, but the uneasy feeling inside the colonel only grew stronger. Each day he went through his usual routine, but something about his world had changed. The silence around him didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. He noticed small things that others might ignore. The same car parked near the corner of his street 2 days in a row. The sound of an engine running outside late at night. The quick movement of headlights slowing down near his driveway, then speeding off again. Maybe it was coincidence, he told himself, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. At the base, his colleagues could tell something was bothering him. One of them quietly asked if everything was all right. He smiled and said it was nothing serious, just fatigue. He didn't want to worry anyone. The military world had taught him to carry his troubles silently. Yet that same discipline sometimes made the weight harder to bear. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the same steady face he'd always known. But behind that calm expression, questions swirled. Why were those officers acting like that? Why did they keep circling his neighborhood? Was it intimidation or something more dangerous? He started keeping a small recorder in his car just to be safe. He also told one trusted colleague at the base about everything that had happened. The man listened quietly, nodding, then said, "You did the right thing by reporting it. Keep everything documented. Don't confront anyone alone." That advice echoed in his mind later that night when, while driving home from the grocery store, he noticed the same police car following him again. He didn't speed, didn't change lanes suddenly, just drove normally. But the patrol car stayed behind him for almost 10 minutes before turning off suddenly onto another road. When he reached home, his hands were shaking slightly. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had faced far worse in his life, but he was angry. Angry that someone would misuse authority this way. Angry that his service, his uniform, his years of sacrifice seemed invisible to people who were supposed to protect citizens, not frighten them. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote another formal note to his contact in Washington. He explained everything, from the repeated sightings to his growing concern for safety. He didn't use emotional words, just facts. He ended the message with a simple line: "I am still calm, but I believe this situation needs attention before it gets worse." The next day, his phone rang earlier than usual. It was the same Pentagon liaison officer. "We received your message," the voice said. "Stay put for now. We're coordinating with federal investigators. You may receive a visit soon." That was both reassuring and worrying. He didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. He had spent years avoiding public attention. But at this point, silence was no longer helping. 3 days later, 2 plain-clothed investigators arrived at his home. They introduced themselves politely, showing identification. They sat in his living room, listening carefully as he described every detail: the stop, the false accusation, the following cars, the intimidation. The older investigator took notes while the younger one watched him closely, occasionally nodding. When he finished, there was a long silence before the older man spoke. "You did the right thing by documenting everything. This isn't the first complaint we've heard involving that department." That sentence made the colonel's stomach tighten. "So there have been others?" "Yes," the man said quietly. "Some have gone unreported. But we've been gathering information for months." They thanked him for his cooperation and told him to stay alert, but avoid contact with the officers. Before leaving, the younger investigator handed him a card. "If anything happens again, no matter how small, call this number immediately." After they left, he felt both relief and unease. Relief that someone was finally listening, but unease because it confirmed his worst fear. This wasn't an isolated event. Days went by and nothing unusual happened. For a brief moment, life seemed to settle back into rhythm. He even began to believe maybe the officers had been warned or reassigned. He focused on his work again, mentoring younger soldiers and preparing for a leadership workshop he'd been asked to conduct. But peace didn't last long. One late evening, as he was returning from the base, he noticed flashing lights ahead on the same stretch of road where he had been stopped before. At first, he thought there had been an accident. But as he slowed down, he realized the lights belonged to the same police vehicles that had stopped him weeks earlier. The moment he recognized the car numbers, his chest tightened. He didn't want trouble. He kept driving slowly within the speed limit, his hands steady on the wheel. But the patrol car behind him turned its lights on again. He sighed deeply, pulled to the side of the road, and parked. The sound of gravel under his tires felt eerily familiar. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, remembering his training, his calmness, his duty to stay composed. When the officer approached, his expression was cold, the same as before. "Evening," the man said. "We need to ask a few questions." "Of course, officer," the colonel replied calmly. "What's the issue?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked for his ID again, even though they had already taken it once before. The colonel handed it over without hesitation. The second officer circled the car again, shining a flashlight through the back window. "You seem nervous," the first officer said in a low tone. The colonel gave a faint, patient smile. "I've been stopped twice in the same place for no reason. Anyone would feel cautious." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then muttered something to his partner. They stepped away, speaking in hushed tones. The colonel stayed still, his hands unmoving. Minutes passed. The flashing lights painted the quiet road in streaks of red and blue. It was as if time had slowed down. Finally, one of the officers came back. "You can go," he said flatly, tossing the ID onto the dashboard. "Just drive safe." The colonel said nothing. He waited until they walked away, then carefully picked up his ID and started the engine. He drove away quietly, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger and disbelief. When he got home, he immediately called the number on the investigator's card. Within minutes, he was connected to someone who listened carefully and told him to stay calm. "We're escalating this," the voice said firmly. "Don't go anywhere for now. Someone from the Pentagon will reach out." That night, he barely slept. Every sound outside made him alert. He wasn't afraid for his own life as much as he was frustrated at the idea of being treated like a suspect in the country he had sworn to serve. The next morning, things moved fast. His call had triggered a chain of action at higher levels. Federal authorities contacted the local police department, demanding explanations and access to body cam footage. The department hesitated, claiming technical issues, but investigators weren't convinced. Within days, quiet whispers turned into public attention. News reporters began to hear fragments of the story. An Army officer allegedly harassed and mistreated during a roadside stop. Social media picked it up first, and soon, the footage from a nearby store camera surfaced online. The video didn't show any violence. It showed the officer standing calmly by his car, following every instruction, while two policemen acted unnecessarily aggressive. That was enough to ignite anger across the country. People started asking questions. Who was this man? Why was he treated like that? How could this happen to someone who had given decades of service? At first, he wanted no part of the media storm. He didn't give interviews, didn't make speeches. But when the Pentagon officially confirmed they were supporting a federal investigation, the story became too large to stay quiet. Calls flooded his phone. Reporters, advocacy groups, veterans, even strangers thanking him for handling the situation with calmness instead of anger. He appreciated their words but remained humble. "I just want the truth out," he told one journalist. "Not revenge, just truth." Within a week, the small-town department that once ignored his quiet dignity now faced national scrutiny. The local mayor issued a statement promising full cooperation, but it was clear the damage was already done. For the first time in his life, the colonel found himself at the center of something he never asked for, a nationwide conversation about fairness, respect, and the way people in uniform should be treated, regardless of what kind of uniform it is. And as he sat in his quiet living room that night, looking at the faint glow of his porch light, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. He hadn't wanted attention, but maybe, just maybe, what had happened to him would spark change. He thought about his fellow soldiers, the men and women who gave everything for their country. He thought about justice not as punishment, but as truth finally being seen. The night outside was still. The fear that once filled him was now replaced by determination. He didn't know what the next days would bring, but he was ready. The world was watching now, and he would face whatever came next with the same calm, steady courage that had guided him all his life. The investigation started before the sun even rose the next day. Federal agents arrived quietly in the small town, their unmarked vehicles pulling up outside the police station. They didn't come to ask polite questions. They came to find the truth. The entire nation had already seen the video. It was everywhere, on phones, on TV, across social media. People didn't need experts to tell them what their eyes had seen. But official truth, the kind that stands in court, takes work. And that was about to begin. Inside the Pentagon, the mood was tense. Senior officers gathered in a private meeting room, faces serious and silent. The lieutenant colonel's photo sat on the large screen, a man in uniform, standing tall, with quiet confidence in his eyes. He had served faithfully for over 20 years. He had led men through hard missions overseas, guided younger soldiers, and represented everything honorable about military life. Now, that same man was gone because of something that never should have happened. One of the generals leaned forward and said in a firm voice, "We owe him the truth. We owe his family justice." Everyone in the room nodded. It wasn't about politics or public pressure anymore. It was about protecting the dignity of someone who had lived by a code of honor. The Pentagon promised full cooperation with federal investigators, and that promise wasn't just words. It meant action. In the small-town police department, the atmosphere was completely different. Officers avoided talking to each other. The chief stayed locked inside his office, making phone calls that went nowhere. He knew this situation was far beyond his control now. The two officers involved had already been placed on suspension. The younger one looked nervous during questioning. The older one, the one who fired, tried to stay confident. But deep down, both knew the world had already seen what happened. Federal investigators began piecing the night together, moment by moment. They examined body camera footage, street surveillance, dash cams, and witness videos. Every second mattered. They matched timestamps, audio, and even light reflections from passing cars. It didn't take long before the truth became undeniable. The colonel had not resisted. He had spoken calmly, politely, and had done everything a citizen was supposed to do. His tone had been steady. His hands were visible the whole time. There was no weapon, no threat, no sudden move. Nothing. The investigators' report grew thick with evidence. They listened to the radio dispatch recordings. The call that had justified the stop turned out to be false. The taillight wasn't broken. It had been functioning perfectly. The entire stop was unnecessary from the start. When the investigators played the body cam footage in slow motion, it became even clearer how wrong everything had gone. The colonel had only been trying to explain himself when the officer reached for his weapon. Meanwhile, the colonel's family was doing everything they could to hold themselves together. They stayed away from cameras most of the time, but when they finally appeared at a press conference, the room fell silent. His wife stood behind a small podium, holding a framed photo of him in uniform. She didn't raise her voice or cry in front of the microphones. She just spoke with quiet strength. He served his country with pride, she said. He believed in fairness. He believed in this flag. And he believed that justice still means something. We only ask for the same respect he gave to others. Those words hit millions of people deeply. They weren't spoken in anger. They were spoken with truth, and truth has a way of shaking people awake. That night, candlelight vigils appeared across cities. Soldiers, veterans, and civilians stood side by side holding photos and small flags. Some sang softly, others prayed. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about every person who ever felt unseen or unfairly judged. Back in Washington, the Pentagon released an official statement calling the act an unacceptable breach of honor and public trust. They promised to stand by the family, covering all funeral expenses and granting him full military honors. When the funeral took place, it was broadcast live. Thousands watched as soldiers carried his casket draped in the national flag. The sound of the ceremonial bugle echoed in the background. No one could hold back tears. Even people who had never met him felt the weight of the moment. It was a reminder of what kind of people the country should protect, not harm. After the funeral, investigators met with federal prosecutors to prepare charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only was the shooting unjustified, but the officers had also tried to manipulate the scene afterward. Forensics proved it. The radio showed a delay between the shooting and the call for backup. And text messages, recovered from one officer's phone, revealed troubling language used earlier that night, showing clear bias and unprofessional behavior. The FBI presented everything carefully, making sure no detail could be questioned. As this unfolded, the small town faced national attention it had never experienced before. Reporters filled the streets, satellite vans lined up outside the courthouse, and residents found themselves speaking to journalists almost daily. Some locals defended the police, saying it must have been a mistake. Others admitted that something had been wrong in their town for a long time. People just didn't want to talk about it, one shop owner said on camera. Now they have to. Inside the investigation office, an agent looked over the report one last time and quietly said, "He deserved better." The lead investigator nodded. "Yes, and now he's going to get justice." When the Attorney General announced federal charges, the news spread instantly. The officer who fired was charged with multiple counts, including civil rights violations and unlawful use of force. The other officer, who had stood by and failed to intervene, also faced charges. The public reaction was intense but peaceful. People wanted accountability, not chaos. The colonel's family released another statement saying they believed in due process. They wanted the truth to speak louder than anger. Weeks later, as the legal process moved forward, more details surfaced about the officer's past. Several citizens came forward, describing previous incidents of harassment and intimidation. Complaints had been filed but were ignored. The town's leadership had turned a blind eye for years. Now, every buried report was being pulled into the light. For the first time, people were forced to confront the pattern that had gone unchecked. The story became part of a larger national conversation. Debates filled television screens and community halls. But for the colonel's fellow soldiers, it was personal. He represented all of us, one of his old unit members said in an interview. We wore the same uniform. We all believed in the same flag. If it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us. The Pentagon, meanwhile, began reviewing policies related to local law enforcement cooperation with military personnel. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they could make sure it never happened again. Several retired officers began traveling across the country, speaking at community events, reminding people that wearing a uniform doesn't erase someone's humanity. It highlights it. One evening, a quiet memorial was held at the base where the colonel had last served. Hundreds of soldiers gathered, lighting candles and placing them in a long line along the main road. The light stretched far into the distance, glowing softly in the night. A senior officer stepped forward and said, "He believed in decency even when the world wasn't decent. Let's honor him not with words but with the way we live." Those words stayed with everyone. They weren't dramatic. They were just honest. By the time the investigation officially closed, the findings were clear and impossible to deny. The shooting was unlawful. The officers had violated their oath. The colonel had done nothing wrong. The federal prosecutor announced that the case would move to trial as quickly as possible. The town finally began to breathe again, though it wasn't the same town anymore. The silence that had once protected wrongdoing had been broken. Neighbors who had never spoken about injustice before were now having conversations in grocery stores and churches and schools. Something had shifted. For the colonel's family, life would never return to what it was. But they found small comfort knowing the truth was no longer hidden. His wife later said in a quiet interview, "I miss him every day, but I know he's still helping people, even now. Because his story is changing things." And she was right. Across the country, training programs began focusing more on empathy and de-escalation. Officers watched recordings of the incident as part of lessons on what not to do, on how small choices can have life-changing consequences. His name started appearing in classrooms, in discussions, in policies. The man who once lived by quiet strength had become a symbol of what real integrity looks like. As federal agents closed their final report, one line stood out near the end. It read simply, "He followed the rules, they broke them." That was the truth the nation had waited to hear. Justice was finally on its way. The courthouse was surrounded by people before sunrise. Reporters stood with microphones in the chilly morning air. Police officers lined the front steps, keeping order as cameras flashed. Across the street, people held signs, not out of anger now, but out of unity. "Justice for the colonel," one banner read. "Truth matters," said another. There was a quiet determination in the air, the kind that comes when a nation finally expects accountability. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. The officer sat at the defense table, his uniform replaced by a plain suit. He looked pale and uneasy, glancing around at the packed room. Behind him sat his lawyer, whispering instructions he didn't seem to hear. Across the aisle, the colonel's family sat in silence. His wife kept her hands folded on her lap, her eyes fixed forward. She wasn't looking for revenge, only truth. Beside her sat the colonel's brother, straight-backed, wearing his own uniform. He didn't speak to anyone, but his presence alone said everything. The judge entered, and the room rose in silence. Reporters lowered their phones. The case had drawn global attention, and the world was watching this small courtroom. When the trial began, the prosecutor stood and faced the jury. Her tone was calm but firm. "This case," she began, "is not about assumptions. It is about actions. It's about what the camera showed and what every piece of evidence confirmed. A man who served this country with honor was treated as if his service meant nothing." The defense attorney responded, trying to paint the officer as a man who had made a mistake in fear, not malice. But even in his argument, something felt hollow. The video evidence was powerful, and everyone in that courtroom had already seen it 100 times. The jury watched quietly as it was played again on the large screen. There was the colonel speaking calmly, his voice respectful, and there was the moment where things went wrong. The room grew still. The sound of the colonel's voice, so composed even in that moment, seemed to echo in everyone's chest. The prosecutor turned to the jury again and said, "He did everything right. He followed every instruction, and yet he never made it home." That sentence hung in the air like a weight that no one could escape. Over the next few days, the courtroom heard from witnesses, experts, and investigators. The lead federal agent testified about the investigation. He explained the timeline, the footage, the radio calls, and the false claim of a broken taillight. He spoke without emotion, letting the facts tell the story. Then came the experts, explaining how the officers' actions broke every rule of proper procedure. One by one, they dismantled the defense's claim of fear and uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, crowds continued to gather peacefully. Veterans from across the country arrived in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder as a show of respect. They didn't chant or shout. They just stood in silence, holding small flags. Some of them had served under the colonel's leadership years before. One of them told a reporter, "He taught me to stay calm under pressure." That's who he was. That's what makes this so hard to accept. Back in court, the defense tried to introduce doubt. The officer took the stand, speaking in a shaky voice. He said he never meant for it to happen, that he felt threatened in the moment. He talked about his years in service, about stress, about fear. But when the prosecutor cross-examined him, the calm tone of her questions began to unravel his story. She played back his own body camera footage, showing that there had been no visible threat. "You said you feared for your life," she asked softly. "But tell this court, what did you see that made you fear him?" The officer couldn't answer. He looked down, avoiding her eyes. The silence that followed said more than any words could. The trial continued for weeks. Every day, the colonel's family walked into court with quiet dignity. His wife carried a small notebook, sometimes jotting down a word or two, but mostly just listening. The judge maintained fairness, reminding the public not to turn the trial into a spectacle. But even he knew this case was bigger than the people in that room. It represented something larger, the idea that power without accountability endangers everyone. When it was time for closing arguments, the courtroom was filled to capacity. The prosecutor stood and looked at the jury one last time. "This case is about truth," she said. "It's about a man who lived his life by principles, honor, discipline, respect." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He served his country and trusted its laws. And what did he receive in return? A moment of prejudice that cost him his life. If justice means anything in this nation, it must mean accountability here. She paused, then added softly, "This isn't just about one man or one officer. It's about whether we truly believe that every life deserves fairness, especially those who've worn the uniform to defend it." When the defense gave their final argument, they spoke about fear, confusion, and human error. But by then, the jury's faces said it all. They had seen too much evidence, too much contradiction, too much truth. The jury deliberated for hours. Outside, the crowd grew larger. People stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting under the hot sun. Some prayed quietly. Others held candles even in daylight. Inside, the colonel's wife sat still, her hands trembling slightly. The tension was unbearable. When the jury finally returned, everyone rose. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson nodded. The courtroom held its breath. "Guilty," the foreperson said, "on all counts." The sound that followed was a mix of gasps and tears. Some people quietly clapped their hands over their mouths. The colonel's wife lowered her head, tears falling silently. His brother closed his eyes and whispered something no one could hear. Across the room, the officer sat frozen, unable to move. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth had spoken, and it was final. The judge thanked the jury for their service, reminding them of the weight of their duty. The sentence would come later, but the decision was already historic. Outside, as the news spread, people began to cry and hug each other. There were no cheers, no loud celebrations, only quiet relief. It was a moment of justice, not triumph. In the following days, the story dominated every headline. Commentators spoke about how rare it was for a case like this to reach such a verdict. But beyond the politics, the story became a symbol of hope. For the first time in a long while, people felt that fairness was possible again. Veterans organizations released statements saying the verdict honored the colonel's memory. One statement read, "Justice delayed but not denied." When the sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was again filled with people. The judge looked tired but resolute. He read the statement of the court slowly, his voice echoing through the silent room. "This court recognizes the gravity of the crime and the damage caused, not only to one family but to the trust of an entire nation. The sentence must reflect both justice and responsibility. The officer's sentence was the strongest the law allowed. The courtroom remained quiet as the judge finished reading. The colonel's wife closed her eyes, whispering a short prayer. For her, it wasn't about punishment, it was about peace. She later told a reporter, "Nothing brings him back, but maybe now his soul can rest." After the sentencing, the family walked out of the courthouse surrounded by soldiers and supporters. Cameras flashed, but no one spoke. The wife held a small folded flag against her heart. It was the one that had draped his coffin weeks earlier, the same flag that represented everything he had lived for. As she stepped outside, the crowd parted silently to let her pass. Someone began to sing softly in the background, a gentle tune that spread through the air like a prayer. That night, across the country, people lit candles in windows and front yards. Not out of anger, but remembrance. Some veterans saluted quietly. Some families talked about what it meant to live in a world where one man's courage could still change things. And somewhere, perhaps beyond what anyone could see, it felt like the colonel's spirit was finally at peace. The trial had ended, but the story was far from over. It had already become part of the nation's memory, a story told in classrooms and conversations, in the quiet moments when people reflected on right and wrong. It reminded everyone that true justice isn't just about laws, it's about conscience. It's about humanity. And as the news anchors ended their reports that night, one line repeated on almost every channel. He gave his life in service to his country. Today, his country finally served him back with justice. Months passed after the verdict, but the story of the colonel didn't fade away. It lived in conversations, in classrooms, in news specials, and in people's hearts. For many, it became a symbol of justice that took too long but finally came. For others, it was a painful reminder of how easily honor could be overlooked by prejudice. Yet through all the noise and headlines, one thing remained clear. The colonel's dignity had changed something deep inside the nation. His family moved quietly, away from cameras and microphones. They wanted peace now. After the sentencing, reporters had followed them everywhere. But slowly the crowd disappeared, leaving them space to breathe. His wife often visited the cemetery early in the mornings, long before anyone else arrived. She'd bring a small cup of coffee and sit beside his headstone as if he were still there, listening. Sometimes she spoke softly, telling him about the weather, about how their son was growing taller, about the letters she still received from strangers around the world. People wrote to her from every state, from military bases overseas, from small towns and big cities. Some letters came from people she'd never met, but who said his story had given them courage to speak out, to stand up for what was right. The headstone was simple, just as he would have wanted. It had his rank, his years of service, and a short line that read, "He lived with honor, and he left it behind." The first time she saw those words carved into stone, she cried quietly, but not from pain, more from pride. It felt right. It sounded like him. The Pentagon kept its promise. They named a training facility after him, a modern center for leadership and ethics designed to teach future officers about respect, calm judgment, and empathy in moments of pressure. At the opening ceremony, hundreds of soldiers stood in formation. His portrait hung near the entrance, showing him smiling in uniform. His posture straight, eyes focused, confident but kind. The commanding officer who gave the speech said, "He taught us something that no manual could. He taught us that strength without compassion is weakness, and authority without fairness is failure." When the flag was raised, a soft wind blew through the crowd, and for a brief moment, everyone felt his presence there. Over time, his name became a reference point in discussions about law enforcement and reform. In meetings, people said things like, "We need to remember what happened to the colonel," or, "Let's make sure this never happens again." His story was being used to teach empathy, not anger. That was the legacy he would have wanted. His wife once said in an interview, he never believed hate could fix hate. He believed in showing people better ways. That line was quoted everywhere. It made people stop and think. His son, still young but old enough to understand what had happened, often asked questions about his father's life. His mother told him stories about his calm nature, his patience, his little habits, how he always woke up before dawn to run, how he loved fixing things around the house, how he never spoke badly about anyone. She wanted him to remember the man, not just the tragedy. At night, when the boy couldn't sleep, he'd hold the small American flag that had once been folded and handed to them at the funeral. "Is Dad proud of me?" he asked one night. His mother smiled softly. "He's always proud of you," she said. "He's watching even now." Across the country, people continued to honor him in small, quiet ways. Artists painted murals of his face on city walls. Schools held essay competitions about courage and fairness. Communities created scholarships in his name for young people studying law, public service, or the military. His photo appeared in museums alongside others who had made history not through war, but through example. He had become more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol of what it means to stay true even when the world turns unfair. Meanwhile, the town where it all happened had changed. It wasn't the same silent place anymore. The local police department had new leadership, new policies, and a new training program focused on humanity before authority. The officers who had ignored complaints before were replaced by those willing to listen and learn. The community started healing slowly but surely. People who had once been afraid to speak up began to share their stories. The town built a small memorial near the road where it all began, a simple plaque surrounded by flowers. It didn't carry anger or blame. It just said, "May we never forget, and may we always choose peace." Reporters who covered the story moved on to other news, but some came back months later to film a follow-up. They found the town quieter, kinder. The local children played near the park, unaware of the pain that had once filled those streets. An old shopkeeper told the camera, "He brought change here even after he was gone. Maybe that's what heroes do, they keep helping even from beyond." In Washington, a new bill was introduced in his name, focusing on accountability and equal treatment under law. It wasn't just symbolic, it had real impact. The bill passed after months of debate, marking a major step toward fairness in policing. The colonel's wife attended the signing ceremony, but stayed out of the spotlight. She said only one thing when asked for a statement: "This isn't about our family anymore. It's about everyone who deserves respect." Her voice was steady, calm, strong, the same tone her husband used to have when he spoke about doing the right thing. No matter how hard it was, every year afterward, on the anniversary of his passing, soldiers gathered at the base named in his honor. They didn't hold big speeches or parades. They simply stood together for a moment of silence, heads bowed. Some saluted. Some prayed. Some placed small notes under his portrait, words like, "Thank you," "We remember," and "Your example lives on." Those small gestures said more than any speech could. One quiet evening, his wife visited the base's memorial wall. She stood there for a long time, tracing his engraved name with her fingers. Around her, the air was calm and the sun was setting, painting the sky with soft orange and pink shades. She smiled faintly and whispered, "You changed more than you ever knew." As she turned to leave, a young soldier approached her, nervous but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to tell you I joined because of him. I read his story when I was in high school. I wanted to serve with that kind of heart." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then keep serving with respect. That's what he'd want." The years rolled on, and though new headlines came and went, the colonel's story never fully disappeared. Teachers continued to tell it to their students. Leaders mentioned it in speeches, and families used it to teach their children about kindness and courage. His photo hung not just in military halls, but in libraries, schools, and homes of people who never met him but felt like they knew him. One winter morning, as snow covered the fields around the cemetery, his wife brought fresh flowers and brushed away the white powder from his grave. She looked at the sky and said quietly, "The world's different now. Maybe not perfect, but better. You'd like that." The wind blew gently, and she smiled as if she could feel his presence again. In time, the story became part of history books, labeled as a turning point. Students read about how one man's calmness, even in injustice, reshaped a nation's conscience. They learned that bravery isn't only about fighting wars, it's also about standing tall in moments when life feels unfair, without letting bitterness take over. The colonel had done that without even meaning to. He had lived with quiet strength, and that strength had outlived him. In the end, his story wasn't just about what happened to him, it was about what he left behind. His wife found peace knowing that his memory continued to inspire people to be kinder, to look deeper, and to treat others with dignity. His son grew up to wear a uniform too, not out of revenge, but to continue his father's mission of serving with honor and fairness. On the day he graduated from the academy, he stood by the same headstone, saluted and said, "I'll make you proud." "Dad?" The sun broke through the clouds at that exact moment, lighting the engraved words on the stone. He lived with honor and he left it behind. And maybe that was the real meaning of his story, that goodness once lived never really dies. It stays quietly, in the hearts of people who choose to carry it forward.